In the last lesson, we explored the history of the human diet and introduced a foundational concept. The human body is ancient and the modern food environment is not. In this lesson, we're going to build on that by looking at the work of Weston A. Price and the broader principles that later became known through the wise traditions movement. And what matters most here is not nostalgia. The lesson is not about romanticizing the past, it's about asking a deeper clinical question. What happens when human beings are deeply nourished according to their design? Because when we study traditional food cultures, we are not just studying old recipes, we're studying resilience, structure, fertility, development, and the visible effects of nourishment. And that is what makes this lesson so important. What if modern chronic disease is not inevitable? What if the widespread patterns we see today, like fatigue, blood sugar instability, the hormonal depletion, the digestive burden, the inflammatory load, the fertility struggles, the nervous system fragility, what if these are not simply the unavoidable result of aging or bad luck? What if, at least in part, they reflect a departure from the kinds of nourishment the human body once depended on more consistently? That is the deeper question this lesson invites us to consider, because traditional cultures often lived much closer to the biological rules of nourishment. And when we study them carefully, we begin to see patterns. Not one perfect diet, but reoccurring nutritional principles that seem to support human resilience remarkably well. Weston A. Price was a dentist in the early 1900s who became increasingly interested in the relationship between nutrition and human development. What started as an observation about tooth decay eventually led him into a much broader inquiry. He traveled to various parts of the world to study more isolated traditional populations and compare them to people from the same genetic lineage who had begun eating more modernized foods. And what he documented was striking. He was not just observing teeth, he was observing what happened to facial development, skeletal structure, vitality, fertility, and overall health when a traditional food culture was either preserved or replaced. That is what makes his work so clinically meaningful, because what he was really documenting was the visible impact of nourishment and the visible impact of degeneration. Across many of the traditional cultures he studied, Weston A. Price documented a remarkable pattern. When people were eating their native, whole food, traditional diets, they often display signs of exceptional vitality. He observed broad dental arches, straighter teeth, fewer cavities, stronger skeletal structure, robust fertility, healthy child development, and less evidence of chronic degeneration. Now, this does not mean these communities were perfect or free of all hardship, but what he did observe was deeply meaningful. When the body is well nourished, structure tends to organize well. This is a profound systems principle, because in systems medicine, structure and function are always in the conversation. And one of the clearest things Weston A. Price documented was this: the body looks and functions differently when it is built from nutrient dense food. One of the most important things to understand about his work is this: he did not discover one universal diet, and that matters. Some traditional groups ate a great deal of seafood, some ate dairy and animal fats, some emphasized organ meats and blood-rich foods, some included roots and tubers and or fruit, some used grains or legumes, but often only after proper preparation. So the takeaway is not that all healthy humans ate the exact same foods. The takeaway is that many traditional cultures shared a common relationship with food that was intelligent, respectful, prepared, nutrient dense, and biologically coherent. And this is a very important distinction, because one of the great misunderstandings in nutrition is assuming that health comes from rigid uniformity. But what traditional cultures often demonstrate is something more sophisticated. Variation can exist within coherence, and that is a much more mature way to think about food. Even though traditional diets varied in form, many shared recurring themes. They often emphasized foods that were deeply nourishing and structurally supportive. They included foods like animal fats, specifically animal fats on pasture raised animals, not like the fats that we see in commercialized rice stock. Eggs, especially egg yolks, organ meats, shellfish, and seafood, full fat dairy when tolerated and traditionally used, broths, fermented foods, and seasonal whole foods prepared with care. And this is where the wise traditions lens becomes especially valuable because one of its most important teachings is this: health is not only about what we avoid, it's also about what we must deeply supply. And that is such an important shift because many people today are not only reacting to poor quality foods, they're also suffering from a kind of nutritional emptiness. They may be eating enough, they may be even eating clean, but they are not necessarily being built well by what they eat. And over time, that matters. Another major insight from traditional food cultures is that preparation mattered. Food was not always consumed in the fastest, driest, or most convenient form. Traditional cultures often soaked, soured, fermented, cultured, slow cooked, used bones, used skinned, used organs, and prepared foods in ways that made them more digestible and more nourishing. This is very important teaching because food tolerance is not only about the ingredient itself, it has to do with its digestibility, its burden, its preparation, and whether the body can actually receive what's being offered. This is why traditional cultures could often include foods like grains, dairies, or starches without the same level of burden that we see today, because the foods were not always eaten in their industrialized form. They were often transformed through traditional preparation, and that is food intelligence. And it is something modern nutrition has largely forgotten. One of the most refreshing things about the Wise Traditions framework is that it is not built around unnecessary food. It does not begin with cut everything out, demonize every category, live on restriction. Instead, it teaches something much wiser. Many foods can be a part of a healthy human diet when they are chosen and prepared intelligently. That means carbohydrates are not automatically the enemy. Dairy is not automatically the enemy. Grains are not the enemy. And fat is certainly not the enemy. What matters is quality, preparation, context, tolerance, and the condition of the body. That is a much more intelligent and clinically useful framework. And it aligns beautifully with the systems medicine principle that readiness and burden matter more than etiology. That is a very important thing for us coaches to understand. Another profound lesson from traditional cultures is that nourishment was not just about avoiding disease, it was often about preparing for life. Traditional cultures frequently placed special emphasis on deeply nutrient dense foods before conception, during pregnancy, during lactation, and during childhood growth. These included foods such as liver and organ meats, egg yolks, fish eggs and shellfish, butter and full fat dairy, cod liver oil, and other nutrient dense animal foods. And that matters because it reveals something very important. Traditional cultures understood that nourishment affects not only how we feel, but what we are building for the future. And that is a very deep nutritional truth because food shapes fertility, resilience, developmental integrity, hormonal readiness, and generational health. This is one of the reasons I believe nourishment should never be reduced to calories or macros alone. It is much more sacred than that. And biologically, it's much more consequential. So, the big takeaway from this lesson is this: traditional food wisdom still matters. Not because we need to copy the past perfectly, but because the body still has the same biological needs. The human organism requires density, digestibility, natural fats, minerals. fat-soluble nutrients, structural nourishment, and food that supports resilience. And when we study traditional food cultures carefully, we gain a much deeper understanding of what helps the body build well, not just to survive, but build well. And that is really the heart of nutritional architecture. In the next lesson, we're going to look at what happened when the food environment changed more dramatically and how the industrial food revolution helped shape the chronic disease landscape we are now living in. See you in the next lesson.